Well, there's something that could be said for being persistent. So I'm going to try to be persistent, and for a second night in a row, attempt to do one of my late night talks after having got out of the pattern of doing it on a regular basis. I don't know about you, but some days I just really have very little to say about anything to anyone. And sometimes when I'm like that, I just don't even try to write or record anything to get my ideas and concepts down. And that alone can also be a problem. That could be a problem from the point of view of maybe I just need to do it, right? So I have to remind myself when I get out of my routine to just do it. Just sit down and roll with it. Now, a lot of times it may be cathartic for me, but I really don't get anything that's of any value to anyone. It may just be me venting after a long day. Sometimes when I write, it's bits and pieces of things. And sometimes over time, those pieces come together to form something that's actually pretty cool. And it actually might even trigger a cascade of creativity down line that allows me to write something, pretty important. Something that has value. But if I never do it, because I don't feel like it, I don't have the construction blocks down line to work with. It's important to push past how you feel and do things that you need to do. Now, let me tell you something interesting. I was thinking about this earlier. In some ways, it's more difficult for me to do these talks here in the city. Why do you think that is? What do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you what I mean by it. When I'm down in Georgia, when I'm in an area that is, in a rural area, or I'm away from people, there's less noise. There's less diversion. There is a change, a cognitive impact being in the cities that's different than being in rural areas. Now, some of that is focus, right? And some of that is the fact that I don't think people realize that when they're in an urban area, when they're around a lot of folks, there are a lot of things competing for their attention. Even at a subconscious level, it has an impact. So sometimes it's much more difficult for me to do these talks when I'm in an environment like that than when I'm in an environment that's not like that. But there's pluses and minuses to both. Now, why am I bringing that up? Well, currently I'm sitting here in downtown Richmond, Virginia, and for 2 hours I was trying to unwind and maybe go to bed early, right? Usually do a lot of research at night, but I wasn't feeling it. I could not connect with what I was working about. I got a little work done before bed. Got a little research in. But in terms of it sparking a line of thought, it just wasn't there, right? And I've been like this for a few days. I've been like this a few days where there's just, the time at which I normally do things is just not syncing, right? So I thought I would give it a go before I shut it down for the evening and try to do a little talk. Now, creativity and conversation and dialogue for me is often sparked by interaction with others or interaction with information and others, right? I value having conversation, right? I'm very dialectic, right? With others. But it's a weird thing. It's a strange thing that it comes and goes in my ability sometimes to articulate things. It almost goes dark at points. Now, it's not that I'm not thinking. Sometimes it's due to stress. Sometimes it's due to frustration. And sometimes I just simply I'm not inspired. But being a creative, right, and being highly analytical, I find that I work best when both are firing together, when they're both working together. And I find it difficult sometimes to get anything out when both sides of that equation aren't functioning together. Now let's use that as an analogy for our system and the left and right in this country. Just like I'm more productive when both sides of my brain, metaphorically speaking, even though that's an out-of-date metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway for effect. I'm much more productive when my creative side and analytical side are working in harmony together. I get things done. And I get a lot of work done very fast, at a high level. But when they're working against one another, or they're not working well at all, I hit slump, a morass, a quicksand, and it makes it difficult for me to get anything of any quality done. And some of that's natural patterns, right? Some of that's just the way that life is, right? Up and down, get tired, get worn out. Sometimes you're more inspired than others. There's a lot of things that aggregate together, right? That can create those conditions. It can become very complex if I were to map them out. So how much more so is it that way in a country where the left and the right are broken? From a governmental, political, and from a societal point of view. And both sides are being manipulated, they're under attack, and they are being turned against one another. What are the impacts? Well, you're not as productive, you don't get things done. Things can bog down to paralysis, and paralysis can increase stress loads and frustration, which increases the probabilities of conflict. Now think about what I just said. And if there's conflict, well, things are certainly not going to get done. You're going to have more paralysis, and you're going to have increased entropy across all the systems, the subsystems, if you will, of the macro system that is the country, its government, its business sector, and the society in general. And we are experiencing that. That's why I often talk about there needs to be a middle ground. But most people in our time are so rigidly set in their perspective politically that they don't want a middle ground, or they see a middle ground in the same light that they see the extreme opposite of where they are sitting in their ideological silo. That myopathy is dangerous to them, and it's destructive to the entirety of the country from both polarities. But that is the world that you've created and has been foisted upon everybody. It is the world that we live in. It's the nation state as we have it right now. And it is facing widespread entropy. You're seeing what happens at a national scale when that entropy, that pathogen of pride, of fear, and of confusion, right, turns into hostility, conflict, wrath, and the chaos that's born from it. Now, in those times, it's very difficult for anything to get done for the good of the entire nation. It's like living in a maelstrom of absurdity and insanity. And regardless of how far you may move yourself outside of it and pretend it doesn't exist, it has an impact on you and everybody else. And it's not a good one. Now, coming out of the last 36 months of being controlled, a lot of people are very edgy still. They've lost a lot. They're angry. They're still confused. That has macro level effects that cascade all the way down to Main Street. Things are not normal, right? And the chance of them ever returning to the normal that we knew before COVID is slim to none. Not because of the COVID-19 issues as much as the impacts on how it's transformed our society with fear and confusion and anger and resentment. We're a broken nation. We're broken people. We're distrustful. We've been turned against ourselves and against one another. So think about that in terms of what the long-term implications are going to be. Think about that in terms of the implications at a geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic level. What have you learned? What's been unearthed for you? Have you seen the reality that we're extremely vulnerable because of decisions and policies that made the normal, that was the normal prior to COVID? You see, when things were normal and they were seemingly good for most people, there were still people that were highly impacted by the choices, the decisions, and the policies that were being made by your leaders, which created vulnerabilities that were exploited not only by external threats, but from internal, unprincipled criminality. It's very, very difficult to look at America the same way now. It's very, very difficult in the state of being that we are in as a nation to see what the future could be beyond the conflict, the hostility, the division, the chaos and confusion and fear that has infected every part of our country. The question is where do we go from here? What are we going to do?
Have a good night.
See you. So if we take the approach that we're going to just let things be as they are, that is denial. If we lean too much to the left or to the right, this country will fall. If we remain divided and at each other's throats, we will destroy one another in this country and create the conditions for our enemies to finish us off. That really leaves us with but one option, and that is establishing a true middle where we can somehow overcome the problems that we have and the issues that we're facing and build a better country for everyone. But it's going to be painful to do that. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to overcome the challenges we have because of the vulnerabilities that we now have and how our enemies are exploiting them, both from within and externally. So we're still in a crisis. We're still in an emergency mode. And if we do not come together as a nation to work together to build a better nation, that will only get worse. If we remain wedded to a lie, wedded to our pride, and ruled by fear and confusion, this nation will not stand. It will fall. Just like everything is out of balance right now. The feminine, the masculine. Everybody and everything is at war against one another. That's sickness. That's dysfunction. That is the way of Babylon. That's the reason why every single empire throughout human history has fallen. Pride, greed, fear, confusion, birthing chaos, hostility, conflict, and ultimately destruction. When I tell you that you're in a war, the war is bigger than what's going on just in our neighborhoods or cognitively in your own heads. It's global. When I say you're in meta war, you're in a spiritual war. You're in a psychological and sociological and ideological war. By the time that you comprehend war as you remember it, in the context that it is now, in a physical and kinetic sense, you will well be defeated. You see, the extremes, the polarities, the far left and the far right only fuel one another. And they make enemies out of everybody. So everybody wants to amass more power and lord it over others, more wealth, more influence, more control. That is a zero-sum game in this country. It will destroy you. And that is precisely what your enemies are counting on. Which is why they're injecting you with every kind of toxin they can, informationally, ideologically, spiritually, pharmacologically, and otherwise, to manipulate and deceive you, to divert you, to divide you, to devour you, and ultimately destroy you. You've heard me say all this before, and perhaps I'm just going over old ground that you don't want to hear. But I can see clearly what your predicament is and where we're heading if we do not change our trajectory. I see the confusion increasing, the fear, the denial, the defense mechanisms, the fight or flight, the accusations and slander. The damage has been done, and it's just right now a lull, a break before the next wave comes. You know, when a nation comes under judgment, it happens exactly this way, in cycles. Consequence, a breather. Time to reflect. Time to consider where you're at and what's going on. And if that is ignored, the consequences scale in intensity and destructiveness. Where do you think you are on that cycle? Economically, socially, morally, ethically, politically, intellectually, ideologically, theologically, and otherwise. You're a broken society. A broken society is made of broken people and broken systems that, if denied and not dealt with, self-perpetuate that dysfunction and grow it with ever-increasing consequences until ultimately it falls apart. That's the nature of entropy. You see, as much as you want normalcy, you have to understand you're not going to get it. You can get either better or worse than you had. And right now, you're actually heading down the path to worse. I wish I could tell you different. But I can't. So I want you to consider these things in light of what you've been through, the way it was before you went through it, and what we're looking at facing forward that we're going to have to go through in the short, mid, and long term ahead of us. Just consider it. And consider the fact that whether you like it or not, you're in a war. And in a war, there are but three kinds of people: soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. If you don't understand that, after the last 36 months, there's very little I can do to convince you. And it means that you probably would prefer a lie and the consequences that will be born from that than to face your fears, seek the truth which can extinguish your confusion, humble yourselves so that you can grow and be led out of this by authentic leadership, or go down with the ship. As it is for people, so too it is for nations.